Again, this is our Transgender Day of Remembrance Memorial and panel discussion. And it's going to be co-hosted by the World Congress of GLBT Jews and Kaddish. My name is Ian, and I'll be your moderator for this event. So just a quick note about logistics and safety. Today, as mentioned, the event will be recorded. So feel free to change your name on the display in Zoom. And we also invite you to turn your camera on or off as you choose. Also know that you can message the host if for whatever reason you feel unsafe in this space. Also, just a quick note that during our time together, it's not a time for us to define any terms or general concepts, or to discuss or answer inappropriate questions about bodies. What we're looking here, however, what we will do is place a link in the chat to a resource sheet, and it'll include various terminology for you to research. So now I'd like to share a little bit about your co-hosts for the event. Kaddish works for LGBTQ equality in Jewish life. They equip Jewish leaders with tools to build LGBTQ affirming communities, create spaces for queer Jewish teens to feel valued and develop their own leadership skills, and mobilize the Jewish community to fight for LGBTQ justice. Founded in 1996 as a small volunteer-run group in Greater Boston, Kaddish is now a national organization with offices in the Bay Area and New York, in addition to their headquarters in Boston. They are the only organization in the US that works for LGBTQ equality in all facets of Jewish life: synagogues, Hebrew schools, day schools, youth groups, summer camps, social service organizations, and other communal agencies. They've developed the leadership of LGBTQ Jewish teens, trained Jewish educators to prevent anti-LGBTQ bullying and celebrate LGBTQ Jewish identity, and mobilize Jewish communities to protect marriage equality and transgender rights. Now, a little bit about the story of the World Congress of GLBT Jews. The first gay and lesbian Jewish organization formed in London and Los Angeles in 1972. By 1975, groups had launched in New York, Boston, Miami, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. In 1975, these groups met in New York in response to the United Nations voting equity Zionism with racism, and became a loose network of organizations. In 1976 in Washington, D.C., the first World Congress of Gay Jews met to discuss common concerns. Then in 1977 in New York, at the Second World Congress of Gay Jews, the name changed to the World Conference of Gay and Lesbian Jews. In 1980, in San Francisco, the World Congress of Gay and Lesbian Jewish Organizations was officially established. Today, we're simply known as the World Congress Kashet Gava. The Hebrew name means Rainbow of Pride and reflects the importance of Israel in our organization. We have member organizations worldwide, hold annual board meetings, and host world conferences on subjects of interest to LGBTQI Jews and their allies. And the World Congress strives to be the voice for LGBTQ Jews worldwide. Now, I'd like to kind of frame the purpose of today's event, and then we will get started. So, of course, the purpose for today's event is just to take a few minutes to memorialize the lives of our transgender siblings that have been lost due to anti-transgender violence. We're also hoping just to do our part to bring awareness to the transgender community and the issues we face. Transgender Day of Remembrance was started in 1999 by transgender advocate Gwendolyn Ann Smith as a vigil to honor the memory of Rita Hester. She's a transgender woman who was killed in 1998. The vigil commemorated all the transgender people lost to violence since Rita Hester's death and began an important tradition that has become the annual Transgender Day of Remembrance. So now I'd like to hand it over to Rabbi Micah for our next section.
I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Director of Education and Training with Keshet. And I'm going to invite us to convene a sacred space together, a space in which we can mourn and grieve, and a space in which we can learn and commit to building a world that is free of transphobia and violence. And we're going to hold this brief memorial in the Jewish tradition using some of the prayers and some of the liturgies that bring honor and connection and elevation to those who have been lost to violence. The Jewish tradition teaches that each individual person, each soul in the fullness of who they are, is an entire world. And that as we inhabit the universe together, the universe that we live in is broken, is incomplete, when even one of us is missing. So I invite us to hold space for that incompleteness, for that brokenness, for that grief, as we prepare to envision and create a world that will be more whole. I'm going to share now a prayer that is adapted from the works of Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, honoring Transgender Day of Remembrance. God, full of mercy, bless the souls of all who are in our hearts on this Transgender Day of Remembrance. We call to mind today, young and old, of every race, of every faith, of every gender experience, who have died by violence. Their stories are infinite and precious. Today, we will name them, our 350 transgender siblings who have died by violence in this year alone. The reluctant activist, the fiery hurler of heels, the warrior for quiet truth, the scholar, the one who no one really knew, the community builder, and more. And as many as we can name today, we know that there are many more whom we cannot, those for whom no Kaddish may have been said. We mourn their senseless deaths. We give thanks for their lives, for their teachings, for the brief glow of each holy flame. We pray for the strength to carry forward their legacy of vision and of bravery and of love. And as we remember them, we remember with them the many more who may have taken their own lives. We pray for the resolve to root out the injustice and ignorance and cruelty that are the ground that grows despair. And as we pray, God, we pray that all those who perpetrate hate and violence will speedily come to understand that the creation in this world has many faces, many genders, infinite holy expressions. Blessed are they who have allowed their divine image to shine into this world. And blessed are you, the eternal, in whom no light is extinguished. At this time, we will light a memorial candle in the memory of all those who have been lost in this past year. At this time, I will share with you the list of names of the departed, and I'll invite all of you to join me in quiet reflection as we listen to the words of my rabbi and teacher, Koach Baruch Fraser, who will be we will be playing a recording of a song called Sim Shalom, asking for peace and goodness and wholeness in the world. I'll ask that we pause for one moment.
Sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, oh, sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, oh, sim shalom. Place peace and goodness and blessing on the world. Grace, loving kindness, compassion on us. Sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, oh, sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, oh, sim shalom. Place peace and goodness and blessing on the world. Grace, loving kindness, compassion on us. Sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, oh, sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, oh, sim shalom. Place peace and goodness, blessing on the world. Grace, loving kindness, compassion on us. Place peace and goodness and blessing on the world. Grace, loving kindness, compassion on us. Sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, oh, sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, sim shalom, oh, sim shalom.
We
May all of them rest in power and in peace. I'm going to share now 2 prayers in their memory. The first is called the El Malei Rachamim, the prayer entitled God Full of Mercy. And it's a prayer in which we wish for them that they should be wrapped up in the wings of love, in the wings of the holy, however any of us might think of that, and in the wings of our memory. Make a note that I will be using the gender expansive versions of Hebrew, so there may be a variety, as Hebrew is a gendered language, a variety of gendered endings in the words you hear here. El Malei Rachamim Shochen Bamromim Hamitzeh Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashchina B'ma'alot Kedoshim Utoharim Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim Et Nishmot Kol Achienu V'Achiotenu V'Achimotenu Shenehergu V'Shenirtzechu Shalchu La'olaman V'gan Eden Tehem Enuhu Chatamen Ana Ba'al Harachamim Yastireh B'Seter Knafecha Le'olamim Utzru B'Tzur Chaim Et Nishmotehem Adonai U'Nachalat Hemen Yanuched Shalom Al Mishkotehem V'nomar Amen. May the Eternal One, full of mercy, who dwells on high, give rest upon the wings of your presence among the holy and the pure who shine like the heavens, to the souls of all of our transgender siblings who have been murdered in this year in acts of anti-transgender violence. May their rests be in the Garden of Eden. Please, source of mercy, envelop them in the shelter of your wings forever, and gather their souls up in the bonds of life everlasting. The eternal is their inheritance, and may their rest be only peace. If you'd like to join me, I invite you to say Amen. The final prayer that it's traditional to say at this moment is the Kaddish. And it's a prayer that is traditionally said by family members in memory of the departed. And there is a tradition that when those who remember someone who no longer walks this earth, when they say these words in the memory and in the honor of the person who's no longer living, that it brings them comfort and elevation, and it is a way of acting in that person's name in the world. So I'll recite the words of the mourner's Kaddish, and I'll invite all of us today to be the families, the loved ones, and the carriers of memory for those who we memorialize today. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbi. Ve'alama divra chirute v'yamlich malchute. V'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chaye d'chol beit Yisrael. Va'agala uvizman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam olamei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitale v'yitadar v'yitalel shmei d'chudasha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tush v'chata v'nechamata da'amiran ve'alma v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. May the one who is above all praise that we can ever offer the one who creates peace in the heights of heaven. May the Eternal create peace for us and for all who dwell on earth. I'll invite you to join me as we say Amen. And at this point, just as taking a moment to reflect and giving honor to our transgender siblings who have been lost this year is a way of strengthening their memory in the world and of doing them an honor in the world. There's another tradition, which is to learn and to act in honor and in memory of those who are departed. So we're going to convene now a panel. We're going to learn together, and we're going to envision together and dream together of ways that we can build the world that each one of our siblings deserved, and ways that we, each and every one of us, can do something to bring that world about. So I'm gonna formally introduce now Ian, who began our time together this afternoon. Ian Brown is the World Congress Officer at Large for the Western Hemisphere with World Congress of GLBT Jews. Ian is an active duty U.S. Army major whose military career spans 20 plus years, 3 wartime and 2 peacetime overseas deployments. He has earned a Master's of Art in Information Technology Management and is studying to become a computer programmer. Ian is passionate about advocating and programming for the transgender community. He uses his lived experience of cultural intersections to highlight the concerns of the most marginalized amongst us and amplify the voices of those that have been silenced. He's the Officer at Large of the Western Hemisphere for the World Congress of GLBT Jews, the Tag Magazine Scholarship Committee member, and May is All About Trans board member. He was the 2019 Harvey Milk Chesed Award recipient and has served as the executive producer of Capital Trans Pride, a panelist for the Flux Transgender Veterans panel discussion, and the keynote speaker for the Beit Mishpacha Transgender Day of Remembrance service. Ian is also a self-proclaimed foodie and a fitness enthusiast. So I'll turn it over now to Ian to welcome our panel and to hold this discussion.
Thank you very much for that, Rabbi Micah. So our first panelist that we're so glad to have joining us is Eliana Goberstein. Eliana is a former stateless, former refugee who arrived in 2014, I'm gonna butcher this, Aotearoa, New Zealand, from China. Eliana was forcibly assigned male at birth, but grew up aware of their intersex condition in Bogota. In 2011, they left Colombia due to the violence they experienced there. Eliana suffered severe mistreatment in Hong Kong due to their ambiguous physical and gender presentation after gender transition in Taiwan. After several attempts of deportation, they applied for asylum and spent years as a refugee in multiple refugee camps in China and Hong Kong. New Zealand accepted Eliana as an exceptional case due to the harsh conditions they were living in Yuen Long. Eliana was stateless for 6 years, but during that time validated their studies in public health, pharmacy and chemistry, and today works as a chief scientist at a pharmacological company in Auckland. They work actively in the field of harm reduction and pharmacological therapies to support people suffering from drug addictions. Eliana has always been connected to their Jewish faith. In 2015, they married Itamar, their husband, who came from Israel to New Zealand so they could build a family together. Eliana is an active member of Jewish Rainbow of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in 2019, they co-founded Rainbow Path New Zealand, a group that provides assistance, community connection, and support to rainbow refugees Eliana is also a board member of Intersex Trust of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our next panelist is Rabbi Leia Moser. Rabbi Moser is the rabbi of Reconstructionist Congregation Beth Israel of Ridgewood, New Jersey. A convert to Judaism, she came out as transgender and began transitioning during her second year at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. In addition to her congregational work, she's the author of Magical Princess Harriet, a Jewish youth adult fantasy novel whose main character is a transgender girl. She also blogs about Judaism, gender issues, and neurodiversity on her website, Da Gadol. In 2018, she received an Auerbach grant for her innovative experiments combining electronic music with Jewish prayer, a project which ultimately resulted in her congregation's Synth Pop Shabbat program. We're so lucky and so glad to have you both taking the time out to join us today as we hold this sacred space, but to also learn from you and from your lived experiences. So again, just a reminder that, you know, what this space is for and what it is not. So we will link the resource sheet to terminology. We'll put that in the chat for folks to look at. But what this is also, this portion here is our call to action. So again, we want to look at and envision for creating a world without violence against trans folks. So what I'd like to do now is just give our panelists a few moments to kind of tell us about themselves and their experience. Sorry, go ahead.
Which is that our chat has been disabled for this event, which is a technological glitch that we were not expecting. But I did want to note that if there are folks who feel that they want to have that terminology information, they can go to keshetonline.org and they can do that. And then later, as we are at the portion of the panel where we are considering accepting questions, if you go to your confirmation email that you received with the link to this panel, there is an email address there, micah.buck.yael@keshetonline.org. And if you submit your questions there, I will be selecting questions from those that come in via email. I apologize for the last minute change of plans, and we're all about problem solving.
Okay. Maybe we'll start with Rabbi Moser.
Oh, okay. So you were asking us to tell something a little bit about ourselves?
Right, yeah, just share with us, our folks today, just a little bit about yourself.
Sure, okay. So I'm a convert to Judaism. I'd say about, gosh, it was almost 10 years ago, I began the process of converting to Judaism, or a little bit more actually. Converted to Judaism in Tulsa, Oklahoma, moved out to Philadelphia to attend rabbinical school. And then after my first year of rabbinical school, that was the point at which I realized I was needing to come out and transition to female. I consider myself, I'm in an interesting situation, I think, as a trans woman rabbi, right? Because as a trans woman congregational rabbi, because I'm in the I consider myself extremely fortunate, right? I'm one of the vanishingly small number of people, of trans women, who are rabbis who are able to work in a congregational space. It's something I've noted that, like, unfortunately, and I know many Jewish trans women out there, and quite a few of them are rabbis, but unfortunately, we're still at a place where there aren't a whole lot of us doing congregational work. And that's something that I'd love to see change over time. And it's really been a blessing, that experience. And also it can be a little difficult when it comes to, advocating for and representing trans issues in the Jewish world. Because as a congregational rabbi, your job primarily above anything else is to take care of and address the spiritual needs of this community, right? Your particular community, which is what that you are serving. And that is kind of, and that is both a universal responsibility and a very specific responsibility. Universal because you're there to be there, you're there to be the rabbi for everyone in that community, no matter who they are, what their gender identity is, what their sexual identity is, what their age is, what their background is, whatever, right? You're there for everybody at all times. And at the same time, right, you're there for that specific group of people, the specific group of people that you are the rabbi for. And that has, I think, been a real influence on my take on how I try to stand up for trans issues in my role as a rabbi, right? Which is, I don't have a lot of congregants who are transgender like myself. And so being transgender doesn't necessarily, and speaking on trans issues doesn't necessarily form like a center or the main proportion of what I do as a rabbi. And yet I try to always be very out there and visible in what I do as a rabbi, and in making sure that it's sort of an understood fact that what I am doing as a transgender rabbi, and that the community that I'm helping build is a community that has the value of being a safe and welcoming and comfortable space for transgender Jews. Because I think really that the necessity of there's I think a lot of value, and I think sometimes a desperately needed value in terms of being out there working specifically in the transgender community. But I think as a congregational rabbi, what I've learned is that it's also, I think, an important thing for us to be working in communities that don't have a specifically queer or trans focus, to be making those communities specifically open and comfortable and welcoming, with our presence, right? With our presence, because it's only by demonstrating all the varieties of people who can be effective rabbis that we can kind of broaden the space of what it means to be a rabbi and start to normalize some things that up until very recently would have been virtually unheard of in anywhere in the American Jewish world outside of the very largest and most liberal Jewish communities. I don't know. That's what came to mind just now.
No, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. You definitely hit on a couple of points I definitely want to get back to a little later.
Sure.
So, Eliana, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, kia ora everyone is how in New Zealand you say hello. And in New Zealand, we also use the word Aotearoa, which is the indigenous name for this land. So something that I always remind myself of making clear. New Zealand is a country that is very respectful of the indigenous populations, and it's something I learned as I became a New Zealander, and that's why I make this emphasis on making this name Aotearoa. So that's something that I just want to let you guys know. Okay, so I just briefly mentioning that I'm from Colombia. You guys can notice that from my accent. However, my origins, especially the origins that explain my identity, come from my mom. My mom is from Ukraine. She escaped during the Soviet Union, kind of like in the 60s, to Colombia. I don't know why Colombia, but Colombia. And that's actually the place in which I grew up, and it was a place in which I learned about myself. I learned about being different in many different aspects, not just because being Jewish or being someone that is not necessarily particularly unique. It's particularly unique in the sense of like Colombia doesn't have like many migrants, and being a migrant like from that sort of origin was already unique. And also being born with a condition that make me different. And also experiencing the violence that we were just aware today on South America. It's not very welcoming to people that are different, especially if you're transgender or you have a queer sense of existence that makes your life impossible in many cases. So impossible that we have 80% every year, approximately 85% of murders for transgender people happening just in South America, which is something that, as I speak, it makes me feel really frustrated to see these things happening. And when we see all these names, this violence that I experienced personally, and that's why it's something that makes me very emotional, because this was one of the reasons why I decided that it was not sustainable for me to stay in my hometown. And yeah, I mean, that's why I decided to leave. The same way my mom left Ukraine because maybe it was not a welcoming place for Jewish. I felt Colombia is not a welcoming place for a transgender person, which is not always the case for everyone, but in general, like, I felt that, that was a chance. I had a chance, if I want to enjoy life as a scientist and not to center all my existence on feeling scared of walking on the streets or feeling that people will not respect me, maybe if I had a chance to go somewhere else. So I went to Taiwan, and I started this process of transitioning, which was different in my case because of my condition, but that process affected my appearance, and because of that, I was unable to change my passport to reflect the new appearance, my physical appearance, and that actually made me functionally stateless. And when I went to change my passport in Hong Kong, the officials couldn't believe I was that person that I was claiming to be, and everything escalated so quickly and so badly that I actually ended up spending 3 years of my life in China, just because of a stupid passport not showing who I was. And yeah, I mean, like, my whole life kind of got messed because I actually was studying to be the person I am today. But, and that's what I have to say. New Zealand was very welcoming. The situation that I was living was quite unique and horrendous. And it's just another layer and another dimension of the levels of discrimination that we have to deal with. In this case, it was crossing borders as a transgender or as an intersex or as a non-binary person. Crossing a border, it could be one of the most horrendous things you can do. I mean, right now with COVID-19, it's not something that we're going to experience, but it's a lot of the different layers that all of us experience. And yeah, I never expected to be in New Zealand, if I'm very honest with you. It's not a country I decided or choose to be in, but it's a country that has welcomed me, and it's a country that makes me feel safe, and it's a country in which I've been accepted for who I am. And finally, my Jewish faith is the one thing that hasn't really changed in the aspects of my identity, in the look, my appearance, my body, in all the multiple citizenships that I had been passing through, being Colombian, stop being Colombian, stateless. No, the only one thing that stayed with me was being Jewish, and it was the only thing that kept me alive and kept me strong and thinking that something is going to change, and that I have to keep thinking that everything bad happens for good, as Rabbi Akiva said. I always put that in my head. I always put that is my way on that understanding that everything bad that was happening to me is because something good was coming, and something good is happening, which is having my husband, Itamar, living in this country, being a recognized scientist, being the director of this pharmaceutical company. All those things are the good things that I was expecting, and I was just following the teachings of Rabbi Akiva that always says that everything bad happens for good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eliana. Your story is so moving to me, and I'm sure it touches so many of those who are here with us today. Some of what you talked about, I think like you kind of already answered for us, but what comes to mind for me is thinking about what we envision for a world without anti-trans violence. And I think that it's probably a different answer for everybody. So I think that there's some core things that we can all universally agree on, but I think there are some things that are very specific to certain people. So I would love for you to give us a sense of what that looks like for you. Like, what is your vision of a world with anti-transgender violence?
It's a world that understands that every single dimension of a human is unique and different, and that the different ways of existence, and it's something that it's recognized. I mean, in the Torah, our existence are fully recognized. All the differences in our faces, genders, and even bodies. I always use the word body because as an intersex person, my body was different, and it's something that often gets ignored. And those differences just show how every single aspect of our physicalities and our ways of seeing and understanding the world just show that it's impossible that you can reduce your existence to two genders or two ways of loving or these things. So if we have all those colors in those different ways, those multitude of languages, multitude of ways, creeds, beliefs, all those things, why we have to limit two aspects of our identity into two things that make life of other people like difficult. So difficult, in fact, that some of them actually prefer to kill themselves, and others actually are killed by the society themselves. Which we definitely, it's just a symptom of hate, and it's just a symptom of that constant pressure that society puts on us. And how can we change that? I mean, what we're doing right now is to show the world that we care about those lives. Because unfortunately, we don't even know the names of so many of them. And I'm sure that many of those who died this year didn't have a proper, respectful, treatment of their bodies. And maybe they don't even have a graveyard. They don't even have a stone with their names written on it. Or even someone bringing them flowers or something, I mean, if you think about that, how horrendous it will be that somebody will just leave that person like being treated like I'm sorry to say this, but garbage. And it's just very unfortunate that we have to make these commemorations, because these commemorations shouldn't exist if we will live in a society that is able to understand that we are just another layer of the beautiful colors of our existence.
Absolutely. Rabbi Moser?
So I think for me, it really all goes back to the book of Genesis. And I don't mean just the parts of Genesis that seem to indicate that the first human being ever created was an androgynous who had, the characteristics of both sexes. And I don't just refer to the readings of early Genesis whereby it's possible to infer that really gender and gender roles didn't exist until after humanity was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. What I'm talking about are the parts of Genesis that are focused on the sort of family drama in the sort of earliest family of the Jewish people. And really, when we look back at those stories of the lives of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebecca, of Jacob and Rachel and Leah, right? Really, what we see in all of those stories is a narrative that talks about the pain and heartache of rejection and expulsion from the family. And when we look back to these people, these patriarchs and matriarchs who are the ancestors of our people, I think it's a real horrible tragedy, right? To realize that that story, which sets up the nature of Jewish peoplehood as such, is also a story in which individuals who should by all rights belong to that family are rejected from that family and cast out. And the world that Genesis presents us with is a world, I think, that's very, very familiar to a lot of transgender folks, because it's a world that's very cold and very dangerous for anyone who doesn't have the protection and security and support of a tribe, of a family, of a people, right? Abraham was a refugee. He was a migrant who left his place of birth, went to a place that he had never been before, and was making a life there with his family. And that's the story of our earliest ancestors. But that first family also was engaged in the process of rejection, right? Ishmael is born into the family, and then when Sarah sees that she's pregnant and gives birth to a son of her own that doesn't come from Hagar, her maidservant, she puts her foot down and kicks Hagar and Ishmael out of the camp, even though by rights they belong there, that they're part of the family as well. And that's the beginnings of our people. And so I think really, like, my vision of a world without trans violence is a world where we're paying a lot more attention to the book of Genesis and to the absolute horror and danger inflicted on human beings for being cast out from their communities. The communities that should be welcoming them and providing them with a safe harbor are kicking them out into a world that is cold, that is dangerous, and that is isolated. And that's a big source of the kind of that's a big enabler, I'll say, of the kind of violence that trans folks are subject to the world over. And so I think really what we need to do as a people and as a world, right, is to do a tikkun, to do a kind of repair on our concepts of family and tribe and peoplehood, right? To get rid of some of those ideas and assumptions that led our earliest ancestors to draw these absurd lines between who belongs in the family and who doesn't belong in the family, and to revisit that and work for a world in which family is something that people have a right to, in which family is something that people can rely on, and in which fear of loss of one's family and the protection and warmth and safety that provides is not a motivator that prevents people from transitioning, from taking the steps that they need to do in order to be right with themselves and their understanding of their God-given truth.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I was over here and awing at that, and that really, really resonated. So it makes me think about just how lucky we really are to have both of you here. I think, Rabbi Moser, with you being in the position of enlightening your congregation and being a model for them, I think similarly with you, Eliana, you just being able to be yourself, being your, as people say, your best self, and feel safe, and you're showing up in the world like that. That in and of itself is modeling for folks, and it's so important. And I think back again to all the things that you've had to do, and I really, really am glad you were here. I'm really glad you persevered, were able to learn and hear about your experience. One last thing that I'd like to kind of get to is, so a lot of people, they've taken the time to come in and hear about, to share the sacred space with us and to memorialize our siblings, to hear about the experiences of some trans folks in our community. But they also might be thinking, hey, I was touched by something, but what can I do? Realistically, what are some things that people can do from your points of view? What can people do to be a good ally? I dare say, like, just throwing labels on people just because you have a certain awareness doesn't make you an ally. There's action that goes along with that as well. So I'd like to kind of hear from you two, what are some specific actions for folks who want to help support this world that we just spoke about? Either one of you.
Eliana, do you want to go first?
I prefer you go first.
Okay, sure thing. I think for me, one of the biggest, so speaking so you're framing things in terms of what can allies do, right? So, and by allies, I'm taking that to mean folks who may not necessarily be transgender themselves, right? But who understand the needs of trans folks, or who want to understand the needs of trans folks and want to be out there making the world a better place for trans folks, or at least a less difficult one. And I think the biggest thing, there's obviously there's movements and political action, and there's all sorts of things, ways in which we can go out and try to make a difference in, a fairly big and flashy way. But I think actually the most important ways in which folks, non-trans folks, can be allies for trans folks is in a much more subtle way, which is making a place for trans people. I talked a lot about the horrors of isolation and rejection, right? Of being cast out of the family, right? And the need to do a tikkun on our conceptions of community and family. That is work that folks who are allies to the trans community are uniquely positioned to do. If you belong to a synagogue, right? Being a voice in that synagogue for normalizing the acceptance of transgender folks, for helping people understand the language and the issues surrounding transgender stuff, right? And for making people aware of the need to be a safe space for transgender people is so, so helpful and so, so important. If you're a member of a family, and all of us are members of a family, right? Making a space within that family, raising these issues before a member of the family comes out and is perhaps rejected by some portion or all of the family. Raising these issues before it becomes centered on one particular person and whether we accept them or reject them, right? Normalizing these issues, normalizing talking about these issues is absolutely important. And it's absolutely the kind of work that, yes, we trans folks are doing ourselves as well in religious communities and in families, all over the place, right? But it's one in which I think there's even more of a role and more effectiveness in the advocacy of non-trans allies. Because yes, it means something coming from a trans person advocating for their needs when it comes to community, but it means something else when it comes to someone who is not personally connected to that, right? Someone who isn't trans, and it's not that's part of their own area of personal interest, right? Nevertheless, making it an issue and talking about the issue and doing their best to normalize the welcoming and acceptance of trans people. And not just trans people, right? People of all sorts of, when it comes to racial background, when it comes to immigration status, when it comes to socioeconomic class, right? It's making a home for everybody within the community is so important, and it's absolutely, that's the work of allies.
Yeah,
I think you mentioned pretty much a lot of things I wanted to say, but the creation of a safe space is so important. It's one of the most important things. I was yesterday. I was receiving an award for the work that we're doing with LGBTQI refugees here in New Zealand. It's one of the ways that I'm giving back all this love that was given to me. And one of the things that I was speaking about other organizations that help refugees is that my organization wouldn't be needed if it's not because those other organizations, yes, they are very welcoming and help refugees, but they are not open in helping LGBTQI refugees. So a lot of people that come into New Zealand, they become completely isolated because they are afraid of even approaching their own communities, their own ethnic communities, their own religions, their own ethnic, everything, just because they're afraid, because there is not a safe space for them. So they are running away from hate. They are running away from that hate even in New Zealand, because they are running away from that sensation of unsafety. So a creation of safe space is quite important. And also recognizing one's privileges are very important as well, because often, yes, we understand that there are a few things that have changed to this day. For the whole LGBTI community is still it's very challenging to be LGBTIQ, but there are identities within that whole alphabet, some people call it, that they are incredibly invisible. And those identities need to be sometimes, visibilized and brought up. And so we kind of like step aside and say, you know what, yeah, there's a lot of things that have been done for me, as a person of such identity. Then let's give the time for this community to, to be seen, to be represented, and to let this community speak. It's not about us taking that voice, but letting them speak. There's nothing about us without us, is what we say. It's about representation. So yeah, I also agree with Leia when she speaks about understanding all the aspects of our identity that actually make our life sometimes even more difficult. And which I mentioned this as intersections, the concept of intersectionality. So I am not just Jewish, and I'm not just a transgender woman and intersex. I am also a migrant and a refugee, and I might have a disability. And all those things make my life uniquely difficult in some ways. It might make my life easier in other ways. But those things are important, and we need to embrace every single aspect of our identity, like a mosaic. All those things are in resonance with your identity, and those things are important to be accepted in every different way. Trans women of color are more likely to die, and actually most of transgender women of color die this year. And also sex workers make up 70% of the murders this year. We need to understand those things, because if we ignore who are the ones that are more vulnerable and more affected, then we are not actively helping this problem to stop.
Ooh, that's so powerful. I think one thing that's really interesting is that we look at where each of you are, just like physically in the world, and how you're still speaking to a shared experience. Everybody is looking for safety. Everybody wants to feel as though they belong. And everybody, we all deserve to be here. We deserve to be here just like the next person. We deserve to have all of our identities recognized, because that makes who we are as a complete person. So I really appreciate you both sharing your experiences with us and your visions and some actual things that we can do. Hopefully someone has heard something and they said, oh, that's actually something that I can do in my sphere. I can make space for someone. I can show up for someone. I can amplify someone else's voice. I can normalize what it is to be different and unique and beautiful, and add to this beautiful tapestry that is our world. Because we're here. We've always been here. We're not going anywhere. We are getting towards the end. We actually have hit 1 o'clock, but I wanted to know, were there any questions? Did anyone receive any quick questions? Okay, let's see. So maybe we'll go ahead and get to wrapping up our event today. Again, I want to just thank Eliana and Rabbi Moser for your time. It's really awesome. Again, nothing else, not in addition to considering your experience, but that to be here to share this sacred space with you. So thank you for that. I hope that everyone was able to leave here with something. And I don't know, I guess that's it. Micah, do you have anything?
Together in moderating this panel, I want to thank our ASL interpreters, Michael and Paula, and I want to thank Zora and the other members of the Keshet team for all of the work, and Goldie from World Congress for bringing together this event today. And I want to thank everyone for convening some sacred space together.